All right. Greetings, friends. I hope that this day finds you well. I hope that you can hear me. And, yeah, I just hope everybody's doing well. I hope life is grand for all of you. Welcome to the Sunday sermon. I'm Reverend Riff. You probably know that. You see that wreath? Yeah, the beach wreath. Yeah, the spare bedroom we're in here has a beach theme. It's quite lovely, especially if you're into beachy things. I am, as you all know, a fan of the beach, but not, an absolute psycho about it. But, well, welcome, friends. We're gonna do this morning. It's gonna be abbreviated. This will probably be about 30 minutes or so. We're gonna call it a Sunday sermon short. How's that? It's a special time. But after all the silliness of yesterday, I would be remiss if I didn't come out and shit all over it a little bit. That's what we do here, right? Um, nah, it's a holiday special. That's what it is. It's just a holiday special. Just a holiday special. But I hope everyone had, I hope everyone had a great holiday. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you've recovered, and are just enjoying this fine Sunday. And if you didn't celebrate yesterday, I hope you just had a nice day. And if you celebrated yesterday, I hope you had a great time. I hope you got everything you wanted. If you had little ones, I hope they had a good time. I know mine did. And finally, before we really get rolling here, we're going to give a shout out to Mrs. Riff for not putting the kibosh on this today. Because had she said, no, we're on vacation, you can take a week off, we would have taken the week off out of respect. But she said, no, do your thing. I don't know why I thought you wouldn't. I don't know if that was a loaded. I don't know if that was a loaded. Yes, you can do this, or if it was just what it was. But yeah, we're just gonna do a quick one today. Basically, I want to accomplish two things. First, I want to just go into, because I find it fascinating, because I feel like most Christians don't know this, the massive, massive discrepancies between the accounts of the Christmas story, or lack thereof, which I think is important, under talked about, but we'll get to that. Also, pardon me while I adjust something here on my very makeshift setup. And then the second thing is, a lot of Christian apologists love to come at you with the idea that Jesus' birth was the fulfillment of prophecy. I am going to offer a counter to that. And then we're also going to do a very brief, but I think important, old ancient history lesson that I think will help clarify why these so-called prophecies that the Old Testament, that people try to claim, that it's pretty obvious and pretty easy to debunk that they're not talking about what you think they're talking about. Hi, Declan. What are you looking for, bud? Um, I don't think it's up here.
Aw, man. What? It's all downstairs in the
Dex is looking for his water bottle and not finding it. And of course, he left the door open, so it's loud. So I'm going to go close that. I'll be right back. Ah, the joys of the makeshift mobile studio here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for bearing with. Let's dive in, shall we? So, yeah. All right. Hopefully you can see my screen. I think you can. Good deal. So, yeah, we're just going to call this Riff's Guide to the Xmas Story. It's just, I got some things to say. So, I feel like something that's important to go into first is, and it's actually this ties in so perfectly because, I do work at that. Yeah, Riff has things to say. Yeah, I'm an opinionated asshole. Openly admit it. Um, One of the things we're going to talk about next week is the actual order of the books of the Bible. And the way we're going to start with the Old Testament, that's going to be the season 3 finale, and the season 4 finale, we're going to launch into the New Testament. Season 4 premiere, rather. But we're going to talk about the order they were actually written in. That is something that I feel like most Christians have, at best, the most cursory knowledge of, is that the books of the Bible were not written in the order they are presented, and that the story in them was edited to seem like it is a chronological tale, but it could not be further from the truth. Those books were written wildly in different orders, and when you know the timeline and when you know the chronology of when they were written, it brings up a whole lot of questions. It makes the editing very obvious, and anything that has to be edited that heavily, you have to ask yourself, is this really the Word of God, or was this some person that edited the shit out of all this stuff to tell a story that they felt was important? And so I think that's really key to keeping this in mind. I have never seen a chronological print of the Bible, mainly because it would destroy the narrative. If you printed the Bible chronologically, the narrative that they attempt to push would make no sense. But that is a good question. And so next week, we're going to launch into it. It is going to be it might be like a 2-hour season finale. We are going to launch in to really discussing the actual order they were written, what time frame they were written, the geopolitical and historical landscape of the time they were written, because that is also key to know what was going on in the world when they wrote those books, because it helps explain where prophecies come from, where kind of the tone and the voice of the authors come from. And it also really turns on its head the idea that anybody whose name is on a book actually wrote that book. That is something that I think is very key to remember too. You ask 99 Christians out there, you ask 100 Christians out there who wrote the book of Daniel, and 99, maybe even 100, are going to tell you Daniel wrote the book. If there was a guy named Daniel, he didn't write that fucking book. And that's key. There's a whole lot of them like that. Newsflash, Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. And what's really funny to me about like a statement like that, the vast majority of Israeli or Hebrew scholars of the Torah would not be offended at that statement at all. They'd be like, yeah, people don't know that. They're like, it's, we attribute it to Moses because that makes for a good story, but Moses didn't write that shit. Certainly not all of it. A single person couldn't have written that shit. And again, that doesn't offend actual scholars of the Torah. Yet, it would offend Christians, which I find funny because, it's not your book. Back the fuck off. So, what we've done today is we're going to look at the 4 Gospels and their nativity stories, or lack thereof, which again, I think is as key as anything, is that not only are there, different accounts, but 2 of the Gospels don't even bother. And so we're going to look at them at the order that they were written, not the order they appear in your Bible, because that is a little bit different. So follow along. Mark is the oldest gospel. This gospel was likely written somewhere between 68 and 80 CE, maybe even later than that. And we'll talk about that when we do the season 4 premiere. But basically, I want you to keep in mind that at absolute best, this book was written 30 some odd years after Christ's supposed crucifixion. If he was real and he was really crucified, it happened around 30 to 33 CE. So this book at absolutely best, was written 35 years later. More than likely, it was written closer to 50 years, maybe even 60 years after his death. What does that tell us? That there's almost no chance that it's a first-hand account. That's important. Some other things also tell us it's not a first-hand account. Again, I don't want to spoil too much of the season 4 premiere, but basically the person who wrote Mark had never been to the Palestine area. There's no way that that's possible, because he gets very simple little things wrong. Like, says Jesus was in this town and he walked to this other town and he stopped in this town on the way, except for the town that he supposedly stopped in on the way was 50 miles in the opposite direction. He also has Jesus do things that no Jew would do. And again, more than likely, Mark was written by a Greek scholar in Greece for reasons that we'll get into later. But yeah, it wasn't written by a guy named Mark who followed him around. It's not a first-hand account. What else it doesn't have is a nativity story. Mark, the first gospel, contains no nativity story whatsoever. He starts off with John the Baptist foretelling the coming of a messenger from God. John the Baptist was a lunatic, absolute maniac by the way people would have envisioned him. Yeah, exactly. Where did this guy come from? Origin story? Not interested. Yeah, John the Baptist wore like clothes made out of hair. He wandered through the desert, living like a fucking hermit and spouting off crazy shit. He is actually claimed to, in the book of Matthew, also have a divine origin story, and that he's Jesus's cousin. And basically the idea is that God appeared to John the Baptist's dad and said, hey, I know you're old and I know you and your wife are childless, but guess what? You're going to have a kid. And that kid is going to foretell his cousin, your wife's sister, Mary. She's going to have a kid. That kid is going to be the Messiah. Matthew points all that out. Mark doesn't find any of that interesting. Mark doesn't even tell us why we should give a fuck about John the Baptist. Just that there's this guy named John the Baptist who's running around talking some shit, and he's baptizing people. Hence his name, John the Baptist. It isn't until Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist that anyone has any idea that he's special. He's, again, at this point, he is about 30 years old, give or take, Jesus is. And there's been no mention, again, remembering that if we're going by the Bible, Jesus, the terrible toddler that killed everybody and worked all those miracles, that's not canon. So as far as Mark goes, and this is the first gospel written, this would predate all of the ones about Jesus as the terrible toddler wrecking shit, all of that. This would predate all of that. And in this story, nobody has any idea that Jesus is special. John the Baptist is baptizing people in the river. Jesus shows up, and John the Baptist looks at him and points at him and goes, behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. And everybody goes, huh, John thinks this guy's cool. Maybe we should pay attention to him. Then John baptizes Jesus, and when he pulls Jesus up out of the water, the heavens open, so the sun shines, maybe some doves fly by, very John Woo kind of thing. And when all that happens, God looks down and goes, this is Jesus, he's my son, and I'm proud of him. Again, no backstory on that. That could mean a lot of things, and I think that's important to keep in mind with the context here as well. Use your context clues, kids, as they often say. Back then, kings would call anybody who was a true devout follower of them their son. They didn't mean it biologically. It was a term of endearment. The way an old guy will call you sonny boy. He doesn't actually think you're a son unless he's raging with dementia, but that's a completely different case. Here, what's going on? Yes, it was like Dutch and Arthur in Red Dead 2. There you go. And I'm glad you worked a Red Dead reference in. Tip top, Bale. Tip top. But yeah, so we're not really sure if he was actually saying that he was the Son of God, or if he was more saying that, my son, as in the guy who's going to do my bidding. Mary and Joseph are never mentioned. Never mentioned. No mention of the parentage of Christ at all in the book of Mark. No virgin birth, no manger, no wise men, nothing. The whole story doesn't exist in this text at all. And In fact, like I said, none of that is mentioned. None of it. And again, not even Mary and Joseph. We don't even get like clued in to a backstory or like who his parents were. Nothing. Mark apparently did not feel. Whoever wrote the book of Mark didn't feel like that was important to the story of Jesus. I think it's also important to keep in mind the way Mark ends. The book of Mark ends with Jesus being crucified, and that's pretty much it. Then it says, oh, some people went to his grave, and there was an angel there that told him he had risen and that everybody should be happy because he rose. That's how the original copies of the book of Mark end. The oldest copies of Mark that we've been able to find, that's how they end. Now, we found some other ones that were written over a century after that tack on a story of Jesus appearing to some of his followers and telling them, hey, you should go out and be fishers of men. You should go out and, save people in my name. But again, it is key to know that those last like 12 verses of the book of Mark were tacked on over 100 years later. That's some pretty late editing, meaning that they would be about 150 to almost 200 years after the events in question. Okay? We all good on that? Good. This is the famous one. This is the one that everybody knows. This is the one that everybody's heard, right? Matthew. This is the one we all know. Yet, what I find funny is people interpolate parts of the other stories into this one. Yeah, this is the big one. People interpolate other parts of other stories into Matthew's. Matthew's story also has some serious fucking flaws. Like some shit that any historian will tell you makes this story super suspect. The big focus of this text is like one of the key focus of Matthew's text is Joseph's experience in this whole thing. And one of the main things right off the get-go, right out of the gates with Matthew, he wants you to know that Joseph is descended from David, that Joseph is of the line of David. Why? Because that is what makes Jesus a fulfillment to certain prophecies. Except for here's the key. If Joseph had nothing to do with his birth, why would it matter that he was descended from the Davidic line? It would matter more that Mary was descended from the Davidic line, since technically she at least had something to do with this. Yeah, gotta make it about the dudes, pretty much. But I've always found that a little fascinating thing, is that everybody wants you to make sure you know that, hey, Joseph was descended from David. I'm not going to get into it today. It's long, it's complicated, and it's not worth it. But feel free to look it up for yourself. Fire me questions on the cord if you want. Matthew's genealogy that he lists in what Christians will tell you is painstaking detail, suspect as fuck. There are obvious generational skips. There are names that appear to be cribbed from other names, and, just a whole lot of really suspect shit that he kind of did to make his genealogy fit that Joseph was definitely descended from David, and a more direct path than his 12th cousin twice removed, which is likely more what it is. But Matthew makes some bold leaps in his genealogy. He flat out leaves other parts out because he makes all these mathematical kind of leaps or mathematical connections that, this many generations this happened, and this many generations this happened. And to conveniently make sure that his math works out, he just leaves out people. So, again, we're not going to get into all that today, but know that it's suspect. It claims that Jesus' virgin birth was fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah 7:14. And this is because the writer of Matthew used a Greek translation instead of the original Hebrew translation. Because at this point in time, the Jews in Palestine and most of the people in Greece did not speak Hebrew. They spoke Aramaic at this point. Many of them had almost lost the ability to speak Hebrew or to understand it. So most of the things that they were reading of the Old Testament, those copies were written in Greek or in Aramaic. They weren't written in the original Hebrew. How do I know that? Because if you know that, the virgin birth doesn't make any sense. Isaiah 7:14 uses the word Alma. Alma is the Hebrew word for a young woman of marriageable age. That's it. It does not mean virgin. It has never meant virgin. There has never been any time on the planet that the word Alma has meant virgin. When the Greeks translated it, they translated it with the word virgin. It makes no sense. Get my notes here because I want to pronounce the Greek word correctly. The Greek word was Parthenos. Parthenos means an unwed woman who has been untouched. That would be a virgin. Why did the Greek scholars choose to substitute Alma for Parthenos instead of using a similar word that meant a young woman of marriageable age? There's lots of theories. Could have been ignorance and just misunderstanding the usage of the word Alma, because again, the people that were translating this were not the best Hebrew speakers, so it could have been a legit, just honest accident. It could have been intentional that, hey, he's going to be born of a young woman. That sounds way less special. Let's say it was a virgin because that's cooler. What I want you to know is that the original text of Isaiah 14 does not, Isaiah 7:14 does not prophesy a virgin birth. It prophesies a birth. Period. That's it. It says a child will be born of a young woman. Okay, I would say that covers the vast majority of births. Yeah, he will be born of a young woman. It's infinitely less prophetic and more like, okay, so a lady's going to have a kid. That's generally how it works. Matthew's story contains the story of King Herod's slaughter of the innocents. There's literally zero chance that happened. Good morning, Barry. Welcome. Yeah, there is zero chance that the slaughter of the innocents happened. Herod was despised. Herod was a puppet king. He was a vassal for the Roman Empire to control Palestine. They didn't give a shit about him. He only, and the Jews hated him. Any self-respecting Jew hated Herod because he was a traitor. He sat on a throne of lies, as Buddy the Elf would say. He wasn't a king. He had no real power. He had to do whatever Rome told him to do, and as long as he did, he got to play king. And he did some brutal shit. How he eventually fell out of favor with Rome was one of his massacres of people. It wasn't a bunch of little kids. The historians of the era, especially the Jewish historians, yeah, you're not my real king. The historians of the era hated the guy. Had he slaughtered all of the male infants in a town, especially a town as big as Bethlehem, it was not a tiny little, speck of nowhere. It was a fairly sizable town. Had he slaughtered all of these children, it would have been written about. It would have been embellished. It would have been propagandized against him because nobody fucking liked this guy. So the fact that there is zero, and I mean zero mention of that happening seriously calls into question how, again, Matthew, for dramatic effect. And why did Matthew think he could get away with such a blatant lie? Well, again, Matthew was written a solid 60 to 65 years after the death of Christ. And it was written by a Greek scholar in Greece who was attempting to make Jesus seem like a rabbi. And Matthew, as we'll talk about a little bit later today, also was trying to fulfill a prophecy that he was too stupid to realize didn't have anything to do with Jesus. So he needed a way to fulfill a prophecy. And the way he fulfilled this prophecy was to write a story about a king that nobody liked anyway and say he slaughtered. It would be like adding more kills to Hitler. You know what I mean? If you said Hitler did this really awful thing, and you said it at a time where fact checking was hard to do, nobody was going to question you. They're like, yeah, that guy's a piece of shit. He probably did do it. And nobody's gonna, really bother you. Step Herod. Yet nobody's really going to question you on it because nobody wants to like stick up for Hitler and say Hitler didn't do that. He was a bad guy, but he didn't do that. And that's exactly what happened here with Herod. Herod was despised, nobody liked him, so nobody was willing to stick up for him and say, hey, Herod was a douche canoe, but he didn't kill a bunch of babies because he thought one of them was going to usurp his throne. Didn't happen. Sorry. Hate to break it to you. Did not happen. Now, an interesting thing to keep in mind before we move to the next gospel, which is the Gospel of Luke, is that the Gospel of Luke is the only one of the four Gospels that attempts to pretend that it is a historical account. It, right in the first verse, says, I'm relating stories that were given to me by others. Yeah, Dr. Luke. He flat out says, I wasn't there. I'm relating stories that were given to me by others to make sure they do not get lost to time. But what's really interesting is Luke copies about 68% of the book of Matthew almost verbatim. Much like Matthew copies about 85% of the book of Mark. That's one of the ways we've been able to establish the order they were written in. Matthew copies a lot of Mark almost word for word, except for that he changes a few details to make it line up with he gets some of the geography right. He makes Jesus a super rabbi. He makes Jesus very Jewish. Whoever wrote Matthew clearly understood Jewish behavior, Jewish thought, and was attempting now to, you have to look at who these books were written for. Mark, it appears, was kind of written for just a general audience, just to let people know this guy Jesus existed. Matthew takes Mark's story and dials it in to make it more impactful to observant Jews and to try to get observant Jews on board with Jesus. Luke takes that same story and tries to make Jesus a little more rounded, something that maybe some Gentiles would get behind. And then John turns it all the way to the other end, and John basically is an anti-Semitic text that pretty much shits on Jews and says Jesus was here to save Gentiles because the Jews rejected him. Keep all that in mind. So Luke, he starts by admitting, like I said, right out of the gate, this is secondhand info. He says, I'm writing down stuff that other people told me because I don't want these stories to be lost. He repeats the virgin birth nonsense, and his story is way more focused on how Mary prepared for the birth and how Mary was consumed with her preparation for it, her thoughts as it's going on, and the burden that she feels with this being placed on her, that she's going to supposedly give birth to the Savior of the world. That is far more Luke's focus. Luke is way more interested in that. Luke has some serious timeline issues. But one other thing I want to point out for a minute. The shepherds. That's from Luke. Everybody, when you see a nativity scene, you see shepherds and magi, right? The magi are from Matthew's story. Luke never mentions them. Not once. Yeah, that's 100%, Bill. Looks like you need a time machine and some ass-kicking shoes, because, yeah, that is entirely his fault. Also, Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Yeah, that's Luke's fault. The shepherds, that's Luke. Luke did not have magi. Luke had shepherds. Again, who is this story written for? Matthew is attempting to write to observant Jews, especially the educated ones, who would have been very pious. They would have, something that would have resonated with them, with these magi or magicians from Persia coming over to pay homage to this guy. That would have been something that would have resonated with a lot of Pharisees. Whereas the common person doesn't give a fuck what these foreigners think. But some shepherds out in the field, God appears to them and tells them, go worship my son, and these shepherds show up and pay homage to him. He's here for the common man. He's here for all of you. Again, it is editing the story to try to make it more palatable to your target audience. What do you do that with? Fiction. So, Luke's timeline issue. And this one is really a big problem. He states that the reason they went to Bethlehem, you know, the story, Jesus and Mary, he takes this incredibly pregnant woman and makes her take a 3-day donkey ride from Nazareth to Bethlehem because of the census, right? The problem is that there was a census. It took place in 6 CE. It also was a Galilean census. There was a non-Galilean census, I apologize. Nazareth, up there in Galilee, would not have been a part of this census. Joseph would not have been required to report for this census. Also, the census taking place in 6 CE has a big problem. That problem being, Herod had been dead for 9 years. So it would be really tough and yet Luke explicitly states that he explicitly states that this was during the time of King Herod. But the problem is that census took place 9 years after Herod died. Quirinius is who held the census. Quirinius was the governor. Luke mentions it is done in the time of Caesar Augustus. It was not. Again, this is what happens when you're messing with old texts that you don't quite understand, is you get details wrong because you weren't there. Non-first-hand account. So yeah, the census doesn't make sense. Exactly. Who wants to let some historical details get in the way of a fine tale? So yeah, the whole plot device that gets Joseph and Mary down to Bethlehem so Jesus can be born there doesn't hold water, because it can't hold water because Herod had been dead for 9 years and Luke got the governors wrong. Some Christian apologists will tell you that is a minor detail and that that's not important. It's hugely important, because if this was a first-hand account or a reasonably trustworthy account, you would get major details like who was fucking in charge, or why did this guy slap his wife on a donkey and drag her, 70 some miles through fucking hostile desert to go be part of a census that, oh, by the way, Mary would have not needed to be at anyway. Joseph would have had to go down there. That would have had nothing to do with Mary. No guy in his right mind would drag his very pregnant wife down there. And we're never given anything to believe that, Mary, the facts aren't checking out. It just doesn't add up. But yeah, Joseph, if he had to go, and again, Joseph being from Nazareth would not have been involved in Quirinius's thing. Quirinius's census was a census of Judea, Galilee and Judea, the different places. And again, someone who was Greek writing this decades and decades after the fact would get these details wrong, because he's, again, not as concerned with the details. And again, in a time pre-Google, pre-Wikipedia, it's really easy to say whatever you want and have people take it as fact, because by the time Luke was written, almost no one, if anyone at all, who had been alive during the supposed time of Christ living wouldn't have been alive. So it's really hard to dispute his facts. John. This is the one. If there's a gospel that rustles my jimmies, it's this one. It is anti-Semitic. It is the favorite of all Christian blowhards. If you're a fire and brimstone asshole, this is your doctrine. This is your gospel. This gospel hates Jews. Yeah, ugh, John. Once again, no Christmas story. He instead, again, focuses on John the Baptist, letting everybody know that Jesus is the main event, the big cheese, the one, the reigning, defending, undisputed heavyweight champion of salvation. John the Baptist he's playing Paul Heyman to Jesus' Brock Lesnar here. It did give us Austin 3:16, so we are forever indebted to John for that. Yeah, again, very similar to Mark's gospel here. John the Baptist is the one. I mean, the picture there, that's literally what happened. In the story, Jesus is just walking around. And John the Baptist points at him and says, hey, that dude, that's the Son of God. And people are like, huh, oh, really? That guy? Again, no backstory that Jesus has done anything special, that he's ever been anything more than just the son of a carpenter in Nazareth. But this guy points at him and goes, that dude, he's the man. Immediately after John declares Jesus the Messiah, he starts racking up followers faster than a hot chick in a kiddie pool on Twitch. It's like the story just jumps into overdrive then. John points at this guy, and before you can blink, people just start following him around. He starts changing people's names. The first thing he does is tell Simon Peter, your name is The Rock now, which is amazing. And then Matthew and Mark, he's like, you guys, you're fishermen, knock that shit off. Come with me, I'll make you fishers of men, which sounds creepy. And they're like, we're in. Then John. Yep. And it's really, it's quite ridiculous, but yeah, that's what happens. And it's kind of crazy that Jesus, he hits all these followers, then he starts performing miracles. And John's book, that is the focus of John's book, is Jesus is this all-powerful, miracle-working, super macho, totally not, he is not humble in any way in John's story. A great contrast between these gospels is the Garden of Gethsemane, where, Jesus asks God to not make him get crucified to save the world. In Matthew and in Luke, Jesus is distraught. He knows this is going to suck, and he doesn't want any part of it, to the point that he sweats blood. Mark, Jesus is more just reserved, like, dude, I really don't want to do this. Are you sure there's any way I can not do this? Please don't make me do this. John flat out mocks that idea and has Jesus say, what, you think I'd ask to get the cup taken from me? Which is a direct reference to in Luke when he asked Jesus to take this cup from him. So again, people are like, oh, the Gospels, they jive, they speak. No, they don't. They are four very different interpretations. They are remixes. They are not the same. And I feel like that is key. Good morning, Palm. So, I feel like now, let's take a little look at the history of Christmas. Now that we've gotten the backstory on the story that is supposedly the reason for the season, let's take a look at the backstory. The first Christmas celebration happened around 336 in Rome. That's right. If you're keeping score at home, that is about 330 years to 333 years, 303 years or so after Jesus was crucified. The date, December 25th, was cemented at that time. Before that, his birth had been thought to be April 20th or 21st, 420 got way cooler, or May 20th. That is when everybody that studied Christianity at this point thought Jesus had been born, was in April or May. Nobody was picking December 25th until 336, over 3 centuries after the dude died. St. Augustine tried to downplay the obvious annexation of Sol Invictus by stating that the solstice was absolutely when you should celebrate the birth of Christ. Notice that St. Augustine did not say, well, this is when Jesus was born, that's why we're celebrating. He says, no, you should celebrate it on the solstice because Christ is the light coming into the world, and the solstice is when the light begins to come back. Wow, that is a lovely little anecdote. It's pure propaganda. Once again, he basically admitted, yeah, we annexed this holiday, but don't worry, it makes sense that we did because we needed to. Why did we need to? Because you need to understand that Jesus is the light. And how will you understand that if we don't steal your pagan-ass holiday? Christmas was largely ignored from around 356 to 800 CE. That's a big gap because of the fallout from the Aryan Controversy. What's the Aryan Controversy? Basically, it was the original dogmatic schism of was Jesus divine or was he a messenger? And the Nicene Creed, I'm sure anybody who's been to church in a more than cursory fashion has heard of the Nicene Creed. All of that kind of went down with Constantine and whatnot, and it created a schism. And over that schism, people pretty much stopped celebrating Christmas because it wasn't important. The holiday that was important for them was Easter, or the resurrection of Christ when he was born was not a big deal to them. And so people just stopped celebrating it because they were too busy fighting about whether Jesus was, truly divine or not. Charlemagne had himself crowned king on Xmas Day in 800. This kind of revived the celebration, but again, it wasn't reviving the celebration as much as Christmas in that sense, as it was more of a, hey, celebrate the king's, coronation, and oh, by the way, that guy Jesus was born. It's more what it was. The Puritans, they banned Christmas in England in 1647. Oliver Cromwell said Christmas is a celebration of drunken revelry, and we don't need it. Now, why would he say that? Well, because Christmas, after around 800, going through for about the next 800 years into the 1600s, Christmas was a time when the poor people got together. You know where Christmas caroling comes from? I would hope you all know this, but we'll do a quick reminder. Christmas caroling was basically the idea that poor people got together and they went to the rich areas of town and they sang songs and made noise and threw fucking rocks at your house unless you brought them out some booze or some gifts, and then they would move on to the next rich person's house. And everybody just kind of let it go. It was a way the poor people could have a good time. And it turned into drunken revelry. And if you didn't bring them out some wine and some food, they might burn your house down or loot your house or throw shit at your house or any other number of things. Christmas was not this pious, somber celebration. It was a fucking party, because it was still, people remembered that you had taken Sol Invictus and Saturnalia, these drunken revelry parties, and you had renamed them. But for the most part, people had kept the revelry as a big part of it. Yeah, it was a great party. And so, the Puritans banned it. One of the other Puritan concepts was that every day should be celebrated as a holy day. So making some days holier than others would be idol worship. It's a logical leap, but that's what the Puritans believed. The Puritans sucked. You want to know who the Puritans produced later on down the line? Richard fucking Nixon. That's all you need to know. So, in 1660, the monarchy was restored. He had thrown the proletariat out, and he had taken control. Well, how do you convince the peasants now that things are cool, even though they just lost the, rule of the common man, and now it's back to an aristocracy and a monarchy? How do you convince them that's a great idea? You bring back the drunken party holiday where they get to fuck with the rich one night a week. One night a year. That's what he did. 1659, if you're noticing your timeline there, the Puritans have left England because they lost control of the government, so they took their ball and decided to go massacre a bunch of Indians. They got to New England, banned the holiday, said same thing. Nobody's celebrating Christmas over here. We got an ocean between us and those assholes over there. No Christmas. It stayed that way. Finally, in the 1800s, the popularity of Dickens, that's right, A Christmas Carol. That's where almost all of our thoughts about contemporary Christmas come from, is that stupid fucking book that, was actually a class warfare book, and people missed the class warfare and were like, Christmas! Because they're fucking idiots. Yeah, that holiday, it started to be widely celebrated again. 1870. 1870 is when Christmas became a national holiday in the United States. 1870. Muppets Christmas Carol is a great movie. But it's still, even that one, sort of misses the point. But yeah, 1870, if you're keeping track at home, slavery was outlawed before Christmas was a holiday. I want you to let that sink in. Before Christmas was actually an official holiday, slavery had already been outlawed. And we all agree that slavery lasted way too late into our history. Christmas became a holiday later. Just, that's kind of the history. So, literally, less than 200 years, Christmas has been an official holiday in the U.S. I find that fascinating because I don't think most people know that. So, the last thing we're going to talk about, the prophecies. Matthew was big on, he's the one. When you have Christians tell you that Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy, Matthew is generally who they are citing. And they are saying that Matthew, his story tells us that Jesus fulfilled these prophecies. I picked 3 that really fucking irritate me because they're so easily debunked. And we're going to talk about those real quick before I get back to my vacation and you guys get back to your Sunday. Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew claims that this refers to Jesus being taken to Egypt to avoid Herod's slaughter, and then his return from Egypt. The problem with that is that the slaughter never happened. Hosea was, of course, talking about something that had already happened. It wasn't even a prophecy. Hosea was talking about the Exodus. Hosea, look at it. He's giving Israel a personification. When Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt, I called my son. How hard is that to understand? When Israel was young, I cared about them. They were slaves in Egypt. I called them out. That is clearly what Hosea is referencing. Matthew makes up a whole story about the slaughter of the innocent and that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph flee to Egypt to hide from this slaughter, and that after Herod dies, they can come back from Egypt. That is why Matthew put that story in, is Matthew thought that this was a prophecy referring to the Messiah, and that he could put in this cute little story about the slaughter of a bunch of babies and a flight to Egypt, and that it would make sense to say that it was fulfilled prophecy. It's nonsense. Fucking nonsense. Isaiah 9:1. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations, by way of the sea, beyond the Jordan. Matthew claims that this prophecy was foretelling Jesus coming and, in his ministry in the Galilee. It was not. It was referring to Ahaz's son Hezekiah, who retook those lands from Assyria and made Judah independent once again. I feel like this is a little more involved, so we're going to take a second here. So, Isaiah was a prophet who lived in the time of the end of the northern kingdoms. And if you remember, we've talked about this numerous times. The kingdoms of Israel, they had split. The 10 tribes in the north, they called themselves Israel. The 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, they called themselves the kingdom of Judah. Because I guess Benjamin didn't really get a say in that. But, so, at this point, Ahaz is a king of Judah. And Isaiah is a prophet who is also an advisor to him. Well, when things got real, as soon as Ahaz became king, shit was hitting the fan. He did not inherit a great situation. He became king, and one of the first things that has to happen is he has to have a meeting with the king of the north, from the northern 10 tribes, and the king of Damascus in Syria. They come to him and say, hey, the Assyrians are leaning on us. It's rough. Maybe you could help us out and ally with us so that we can fend them off. Isaiah tells Ahaz, don't do it. Just trust God. Don't make alliances with anybody. Just trust God. Instead, Ahaz goes straight Machiavelli and makes an alliance with the Assyrians. Says, hey, I won't get involved. I won't support them if you leave me out of this. And what happens? King Sennacherib, the king of the Assyrians, comes down and he takes the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali from the northern kingdoms. He annexes it. He also destroys and pretty much razes Damascus to the ground. He also starts to put some pressure on Ahaz that, hey, I'm coming for you next, because, yeah, I made a treaty with you, and that treaty was fine for then, but once I'm done mopping the floor with your buddies up here, I'm coming for you, Holmes. This has Ahaz shitting himself. And Isaiah is prophesying that Ahaz's son, Hezekiah, is going to take those lands back from Assyria and make Judah independent once again. And historically, it sort of adds up and it sort of doesn't. What I mean by that is the Bible tells of a tale of Sennacherib's troops camped outside of Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, and they are ready to throw down. And because Hezekiah is a good, just king, God sends the angel of death, who comes down and in one night kills 185,000 Assyrian troops overnight. The Assyrians flee back to Nineveh and are no longer a problem during Hezekiah's reign. That's not what happened. Now, there is some belief. The Assyrians were not the kind of guys to write down their defeats. They did not really like keeping historical records about times that didn't go well for them. They were very selective editors of their histories. So, had 185,000 guys died overnight, they probably wouldn't have written it down because it wouldn't have made them look good. But what is actually believed to have happened historically is that there was some outbreak of a plague among Sennacherib's troops, and a lot of them died. And so in his campaign, rather than going all the way down and smiting Jerusalem, he made a deal with Hezekiah. Yeah, you're stunned, right? He made a deal with Hezekiah to basically let Hezekiah rule over a lot of those lands that he had taken from the northern tribes. It was easier for Hezekiah to control them. He was much closer proximity-wise, and he would pay tribute to always blaming disease on us. But it would be much easier to allow him to be the administrator of those lands, and he would pay a tax back to the Assyrians. The Bible leaves out that tax and instead talks about how Hezekiah retook those lands, and once again Judah reigned over one of the biggest times and most expansive borders that the kingdom of Judah had ever had. That part's true. They did have the biggest borders Judah had ever had, because they were paying Sennacherib for it. Sennacherib would later go on to famously sack Babylon in 689. He destroyed Babylon. And after that, it didn't sit well with a lot of folks. And 8 years later, his two sons murdered him. They committed regicide and patricide in the name of restoring the love of their gods to them. They ruled that their gods were pissed that he razed Babylon. So, at that point, what was really happening is their capital city, Nineveh, had kind of exhausted a lot of its resources and was starting to fall into disarray. And they basically moved their capital and they fought with each other. And the one brother said, I'll go rebuild Babylon and make that my capital. You stay here at Nineveh. And then the brother who rebuilt Babylon became wealthy and powerful and eventually kicked the other brother's ass. And so when we think of the Babylonian Empire, they didn't really as much defeat the Syrian Empire as they the Assyrian Empire kind of became the Babylonian Empire. Is kind of interesting, just little historical context for what he's talking about there. But yeah, it was not a prophecy foretelling Jesus coming. He was talking about Hezekiah coming and taking back the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali. He was taking those lands back, which, I mean, again, he paid for them, but he did take them back. So, but nobody in the classic times thought that this was a prophecy about anything other than Hezekiah. It was Matthew who decided, no, he was talking about Jesus and his missionary work in the Galilee. No. He wasn't. He was talking about Hezekiah. Jeremiah 31:15. Jeremiah is another prophet that the freaking Christian apologists love to point to as a guy that predicted Jesus. A voice had heard his Ramah, mourning and great weeping, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Matthew claims that this is referring to Herod's slaughter, which, again, we know did not happen. It just didn't. What is actually being referenced there is the fact that the Israelites are not in Israel anymore. They're in Babylon. Of course, 586, Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem. And see, that's what people don't understand. People think that Jeremiah was written much earlier. It wasn't. Jeremiah was likely written around 550 BCE, and that would have been by Jews in exile in Babylon. See, this was a common way of pacifying conquered peoples, is when Nebuchadnezzar and kings before him, when they would come in, the Assyrians, all the way back to Sennacherib, they did this. When they would come in and conquer a people, they would slaughter the ones that they didn't think were worth anything. It's brutal, but that's how it worked. Then, if they thought you were useful to them, they would take you back to their area and indoctrinate you, especially if you were younger. If you were a teenager or a young man, they would take you back to their kingdom and indoctrinate you in their ways. And then eventually, as you had grown, they would let you go back to your area, already knowing that you had now been indoctrinated with their gods, their ways, their customs, and trying to create an almost Stockholm syndrome, if you will, that would make you feel dependent on them. They found that this made it was much easier to pacify places this way than to have to constantly keep soldiers in a conquered city in order to keep it from rebelling. It's just much easier to take anybody who's worth, indoctrinating back to your area, work on them for a decade or so, then you can let them go back. In the meantime, you send your own people to go live and immigrate and populate the town that you'd taken over. Yeah, it's religious, but it was more than that because it was political indoctrination too. It was a whole, creating a dependency on the, people who had taken you over to control them. So yeah, what Jeremiah was written when the people were in exile, that's what he's talking about. Never mix religion and politics. Yeah. He's talking about the great weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, because they are no more. Because there's no Israelites left in Canaan. They've all been scattered to the winds, and they're now, at this point, living in Persia with Darius and the Medes. Because remember, it was Babylon that destroyed the northern kingdom. It was Cyrus and company who destroyed the southern kingdom and took them all back. It's it's not that big of a deal. Like he was talking about that. Everybody wants to make it like he was talking about something completely different than what he actually was, because that's how propaganda works, folks. So thanks for being here. I hope that was, a little bit more enlightening to you about where all this nonsense came from. But if you took anything away from this, it's that the Gospels can't agree on Jesus' origin story. His origin story is murkier than the Joker's. And that the prophecies, every time somebody tells you, oh, Jesus fulfilled these prophecies, he didn't. He did not fulfill those prophecies. It's not even like they were wrong. They weren't even talking about him. This is Matthew taking ridiculous prophecies and trying to make them fit his story to add gravity to his story. Propaganda that over there. That's pretty good. But hey, thank you all for being here. Thanks for bearing with me in my very makeshift setup this morning. I hope it wasn't too hard to follow along. But thank you guys so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And next week, We are going to kick off the new year with quite possibly the spiciest of all sermons, because I am going to go through the entire Old Testament in chronological order that it was written and give you a little synopsis about what each book is and what it was actually written for. And then we'll look at why Christians reordered them to serve their own purpose. You will be stunned when you find out what the actual how many books were written before Genesis. Let's put it that way. When you find out how many books were written before Genesis, I think it will stun you. And we are going to look into also, I know Bale, especially you, I think all of you will enjoy this, but Bale, there are a series of prophets from the Old Testament that nobody ever preaches from. No pastor almost ever talks about these prophets. I highly doubt anyone has really ever heard a sermon based on one of these prophets' books. Do you know what these prophets are called by Jewish scholars? They're called the social justice prophets. And the entire basis of their ministry was the discrepancy in wealth between the rich and the poor, and that God was going to punish anyone who did not attempt to close the wealth gap, anyone who mistreated the poor, anyone who mistreated widows and sick children, anybody who didn't try to help his fellow man, that God was coming for their neck. And so, conveniently, nobody ever talks about those anymore. They also happen to be the actual earliest biblical texts. They were written around between 745 and 625 BCE. So the earliest biblical texts are actually the social justice prophets. And to this day, nobody talks about them anymore. Instead, those are parts that we've tucked away at the end of the Old Testament, easy to ignore, and they're just funny names that you learn when you learn to pronounce, when you learn to, learn all the names of the Bible in order. Well, we're going to fix that. We're going to talk about the social justice prophets. We're going to give them their due, and we're going to talk about how they actually set the tone for the rest of the Old Testament, and that people ignored them and were like, hey, let's just tuck them away here at the end, and let's put all the stuff that we want you to read at the beginning. I think it is going to be a blast. I cannot wait to share it with you all. I'm very, very excited to see your response. Yeah, communists. I really want to enlighten you all, because I think this will help. Anytime you're having to debate the Old Testament with a Christian apologist, you actually knowing the timeline and the motives behind the reorganization of the books is going to be very helpful to you. I really think it is. So thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I'm going to go back to my vacation and go beg Mrs. Riff's forgiveness for this being a full-fledged sermon instead of a sermon short like it was supposed to be. But when you get going, it's just hard to stop, and it's just too much fun. So, thank you all for being here. Love you guys to death. Merry Christmas and the happiest of New Year's. There will not be a real scary this week, because I will be returning to the lovely city of Pittsburgh that day. So no real scary this week. There will be a Dex and Riff stream somewhere in there. And then we will see you the Sunday after January 2nd. We're going to bring the thunder. And that will wrap up Season 3. And we'll take a little break, and then we'll come at you with Season 4. So thank you so much for being here, everybody. Seriously, the fact that you guys were here today, it means a lot. So have a good one, and I'm going to go back to enjoying vacation. Take care, everybody.